Hey, everybody. Today I'm joined with the one and only Layman Pascal to talk a little bit about the Metamodern Spirituality Fall Retreat that Layman's going to be leading here at Sky Meadow, the retreat center that I caretake for and live at. And yeah, just wanted to get a little bit of this stuff out there and give people a little taste of what this is going to look like, and talk maybe just a little bit about the retreat kind of vibe in general, and what this particular retreat's going to be about. So either I or you, Layman, can kind of just give the logistical rundown of, when is this and where and, who and why and all of the interrogatives.
Well, why don't you do that part? Because you're
Sure.
like the on the ground hosty guy, and I'm like the talky guy.
Sounds good. All right. So to answer my own questions, the when is this retreat's happening September 30th to October 2nd. As sort of the official 3-day retreat, which is going to be also how we did this in the spring earlier this year, which now feels like a world away. But that's sort of going to be the main time frame, though I will add that there's going to be, in the week kind of leading up to that weekend, a sort of intentional community-ish vibe, people coming early starting on September 26th. And that's sort of an opportunity for whoever wants to come early and sort of have more time to sink into the land. We're going to be working on things together, kind of living permaculturally and intentionally, and doing some kind of intentional practice around working in the garden and kind of connecting with this beautiful, incredible spot here. Sky Meadow is 115 acres in Northeast Vermont. And it's been a homestead of some kind for, 150 years or something. So, and an organic garden and retreat center for about 25. So yeah, that's sort of the basic structure. The who is one Layman Pascal, who's going to be, again, coming back to talk, lead discussions, lead conversations, and also going to be joined by Greg Enriquez again, who is also involved in the spring. And Greg will also be engaged in some conversation and some presentation. And so I guess that pretty much covers the who. I'll leave the other existential questions for people to ponder internally. Layman, you were keen to kind of maybe do some kind of a theme to structure some of the conversation and discussion. And I believe that the theme that you are going to be kind of framing things through is goodness, the question of goodness, the idea of goodness in today's world. So I don't know, that might be an interesting way into talking about some of this, would be to explore why that theme and what that means to you and what sort of weighs into that question you're interested in. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean that opens up a really rich territory, and maybe I'll just say a few general words first before we
Yeah,
dive into the goodness.
that sounds good. That sounds good.
Good. I'm going to be flying down on the 26th, and as of the 27th, there'll be sort of sittings and pondering themes in the day for the people who are at the pre-retreat who want to join with that. And then on the concentrated days, there'll be a couple of talks, and there'll be much more group engagement than there was last time in terms of soliciting information from the participants rather than just from me. We're going to have Greg give a talk and some feedback on his stuff, and maybe he'll also do an interview with me like was done last time. But I also wanted to highlight the land, the landscape, the ecological piece that I think is really important, and the fact that we're going to be bringing in more ritual elements. There'll be like an opening and closing, and some of the preparation for the opening and closing ritual will be done by the people who are at the pre-retreat. That's going to try to instantiate the field a little bit more. This is it's the second Metamodern Spirituality in-person gathering. I'd like to say, get used to having this on the calendar. It's a beautiful location. There's plenty of opportunities to make contact with landscape, the right kind of people, to be of service to the farm that supports the retreat center. And it's pretty clear that Vermont is, at least for the time being, becoming one of the major hubs in liminal culture. If the last gathering was any indication, the quality of the participants will be very high, very tuned in, very welcoming. The intersubjective field that emerged last time was deeply nourishing, really empowering, I thought. And these sorts of spaces are, they're an important piece of our overall life of practice, and they hold seeds for the possible transformation of the civilization. It can be easy embedded in your own life to forget how essential this meta community dimension is. But when you're in it, or when you're back in it, it's sort of self-evidently, implicitly significant in a way that's hard to deny. So I'll be giving talks, I'll be leading discussions, I'll be setting some pondering themes, suggesting practices, trying to elicit collective insights, and trying to put more people and more types of people on stage, so to speak. And you mentioned Greg's going to be in there. We're very happy. I want to hear from Greg how key goodness is to the model of unified theory and knowledge that he's got, how important it is to have a model of psychological and mental health that puts worthiness and goodness at its core. But I also want us to be able to provide some feedback to Greg about, here's how all that stuff lands with us. Here's what we hear you saying. That sort of thing. And that's a really interesting possibility you and I discussed the other day, that these events could open up a kind of like meta focus group phenomenon where the community can speak back to people who have something to say and inform them about how it's landing and how maybe it would be tweaked. And like I said, very happy there's going to be more of an experiential ritual element. Now, I could segue right into the theory of goodness sort of part, but maybe I'll throw back to you before I do that, because I've been talking for a few minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much more to add. That's a great little synopsis and envisioning of things to come. Yeah, I think that was great. So why don't you hop into some of your considerations of goodness? And I mean, I'd particularly be interested just to know up front, like why that particular topic seemed to ring important to you.
Yeah, there's two ways to go at that, and maybe I can do one and we'll come back to the other, because there's a theory part and there's like a personal experience part. So I'll start with theory. Wisdom is something like virtue-oriented, empathetic metacognition that draws on the existential background of becoming and expresses itself as the generalization over multiple scales of experience, of expertise that's gained relationally in embedded contexts. And by expertise, we mean something like embodied adaptive ability to reciprocally adjust multiple values toward omni-win solutions. So that's the big project we're all kind of engaged in. And I'm phrasing it in a way that's plausibly metamodern. It's spiritual and scientific and psychological and philosophical all at once, clarifies the task of responding to the meta crisis on that basis, and orients toward practice in lived contexts with a minimized set of metaphysical claims. Okay, that's all great. But in all of that, there's a piece that's easy to overlook, which is the virtue-oriented empathetic piece, the goodness question. And it would be, as I conversed with Soryu at Maple about fairly recently, unwise to define wisdom in a way that's not inherently good. So the metamodern spirituality and new wisdom communities and Game B and Liminal Web and Dark Renaissance and emerged networks and all these cousin communities, integrative culture, I think they need to focus more intensely on the nature and cultivation of goodness, which has tended to get left behind with some of the older traditional metaphysical and religious discussions. But how do we do that in a way that isn't merely naive, doesn't retreat to folksy idealism or overly simplistic philosophy? My question is, what kind of goodness could Nietzsche get behind? What sort of goodness seduces us to the far shore of postmodernism? What's post-pluralistic, trans-relativistic, scientifically up-to-date goodness with an emphasis on embodied pragmatism rather than on ontological assertions? So the way I'm coming at this is I want to be sincerely ironic with heartfelt skepticism and not just default into either a world-ignoring traditionalist normativity or a modern mechanistic indifference to virtue or the postmodern flattening of all of this into useless contextualism. I want to be really good. I want to really help us be better and promulgate virtue in a non-oppressive, life-positive, complex, nuanced fashion that also understands how radical diversity can be. So that's the mood that I come at this from. How does that land with you?
Yeah, that's really rich. I like everything in my orientation towards metamodern spirituality. I think that does speak to the desire to reclaim and reapproach traditional notions and indigenous notions and ancient notions of things like the good, or even any of the sort of transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful. But to do so in a way that takes into account all of the insights and the developments and the sort of progressive revelations of the scientific modernist world and the highly pluralistic contextualized postmodern world. And I think that means somehow integrating this sort of deeper scrutiny and skepticism into our notions of transcendentals. So it sounds like that's sort of a bit of where you're coming at this from, and in a very fascinating way. It almost seems like that requires somehow kind of bringing into our considerations of the good, the, how would I put this? Various forms of the not good, I guess, and trying to do some kind of a synthesis there, whether that not good is the contextual realization of the nature of good as a construct, or whether that not good is the supposition that when you examine the world empirically and objectively, value disappears from it. So trying to bring some semblance of recognition of those realities into a postmodern conception of the good seems like a good idea. And I realize as I say all that, it probably sounds very heady. So I'm also very interested in the embodied nature of this, and the kind of, the lived reality, and how that feels, because all this is just theory unless it really makes us good and better people. So that's where that lands.
Yeah, that's absolutely. I mean, part of me, my intellectually oriented philosophical component, is intrigued by what are the metaphysics of a kind of good that we're speaking of that can unfold things that might traditionally have been considered to be not good? And how do we tease apart what wasn't good and what might actually have been good, but which was marginalized, repressed, or ostracized under those conditions? Like when I say, what kind of good could Nietzsche get behind? Well, like, if you see the whole system as power dynamics, where do power dynamics produce goodness? And what kind of empowerment does that represent? Right. And what are the things that used to get excluded from decency that actually should be considered to be more decent in a way that postmodernism opens our eyes to? Things that are just part of the energetic or neurodiverse or socially constructed diversity that really is an acceptable part of the world that our ancestors might have pushed off to the side out of anxiety or out of survival necessities or something like that, that have to be folded into our idea of goodness now. But that's all, like you were saying, very heady. Those aren't really the questions I want to go at, although there'll be some of that in the background. I want to bring up for us questions around what kind of moral intelligence cultivation can we have that goes beyond the lame university approach of considering different moralities and playing thought games about shoving people in front of trains, right? I want, what's the embodied sense of how do we make remorse for our actions work better, right? How do we close the gap between our values, our sense of goodness, and our behavior? How do we suffer that in-between space in a way that's constructive rather than, degenerative? How do we flip the thing, right? How do we understand evil in a metamodern sense, such that we can understand goodness as its reciprocal? What's the biochemistry of ethical valences, right? That sounds like a heady question, but that's a very physical, very practical question. What are the postures? How do you do contemplations that attune us to non-stupid goodness? How did people think about this in the age of the prehistoric shaman philosophers, before any of our moralistic traditions emerged? What were the goodness practices of prehistoric spiritual people? What kind of goodness might we legitimately say exists in nature? And I think a very practical question, how do we make our understanding of goodness deeply ecological so that we can't tease those apart. Because if we can be good apart from nature, we end up with the kind of meta crisis collapse that we're facing now. So how do we make sure ecology is built into goodness from the beginning? Well, those are some of the questions on my mind.
Wow. Well, cool. I'm excited for this. And I feel like there's so much there to unpack that I mean, it'll be a very full weekend of exploring these ideas. I don't know. Is there anything else about this whole retreat or these topics that you feel like you'd want to bring up in sort of just to whet people's appetite for this sort of a thing?
Well, I think one of the things I want to stress is these are some of the angles I'll be coming at it from, but my sense is most of us have an undeveloped hunch about goodness, and we're curious to see where it fits into the new world space. And we probably haven't put enough thought into what it means, how to clarify it, how to speak it, because sometimes it's even embarrassing now to speak about goodness. So how do we get over that micro taboo? How do we hear each other on the subject of goodness? And I think everybody is going to come into this holding some partially constellated piece of the goodness puzzle. So as much as I'm keen to tell people my thoughts and lead people on some practices that might be helpful, I'm really interested in getting the intelligence out of everybody in front of everybody to see what kind of goodness picture we can put together. And how do we increase care? How do we increase our integrity? And how do we move that into a kind of goodness that doesn't just transform us, but becomes contagious? How do we get a pandemic of virtue going? Because without that, the world's doomed and our personal practice is doomed. So we need to take this very seriously, even if we are in a more sophisticated intellectual position than our ancestors might have been. So if that's a nice chunk there, but if you and I want to keep talking about this and going deeper, I'm happy to do that as well.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just a couple more minutes, because I do wonder if you see a direct correlation between this kind of approach to goodness that you're interested to explore and some of these deepening movements into spiritual ritual practice and ritual construction. If the role of ritual, ceremony, and intentional kind of containers like that, and certain kinds of shared spiritual activity, if there's a particular lens, a goodness lens on that, if you have any thoughts on that intersection.
Yeah, I would come at that from two angles. One angle is the joint participation in ritual. When you're in something, then you don't get the opportunity to, I mean, you can still be ironic, you can still be a playful participant, but you don't get to be skeptically or cynically outside of it. You're deeply embedded in your irony. And that togetherness in ritual often places us together on the same page emotionally with other people in a way that we feel is good. It makes us beholden to them and then beholden to us in a certain regard, and to the objects that we're dealing with in sacred processes. Because I think sacredness is interesting, right? It seems to be, it's a bit like eroticism, where yes, things trigger this mode that we were evolved to have, but at the same time, this mode creates things and projects them onto the other. Right. So I think there's a sacred participatory mode that's partly projective and partly responsive. And one of the things that does is to make places and to make objects seem valorized in a special way. And that valorization is, in a way, an encounter with the possibility of the intrinsic goodness of things. Now, we don't need to buy into a metaphysics in which everything just is inherently intrinsically good. Because it is, or because some intrinsically good thing at the beginning put that goodness there. We can play with those ideas, but we're not obligated to them, right? We could just as well say that we projected that onto those things. Nonetheless, it still functions the same way. That we need to be able to encounter places, encounter each other, encounter objects and spaces as valorized in some coherent fashion that stimulates us to feel better existentially, be healthier physiologically, be more coordinated as beings, and be relationally beholden to each other in the world in a special way that makes those states of valorized coherence more likely to occur in the future. So I think the sacred participatory element of ritual really opens that up as a possibility.
Yeah, you mentioned the kind of embarrassment that can come these days from speaking about things like goodness, and I was recently sharing some of my thoughts with Scout Leader Wiley about ritual and the same kind of potential embarrassment, because I was reading Jonathan Rowson has this spiritualized book, and we just talked in a conversation, so I was going through that a little bit, and he quotes Kant at one point, who basically says it's kind of the condition of modern man, such that if someone were to stumble upon him praying like in his bedroom on his knees, that man would be incredibly embarrassed by that, which sort of marks a distinction between kind of whatever modern man, quote unquote, is and pre-modern man, quote unquote. But that embarrassment factor is very interesting, because I think there is sort of, it's bound up with the sense of naivete, which again, I think is where the possibilities of a sincerely ironic or an informed naivete sensibility come into play. And I was talking to Scout about the notion of kind of ritualistic or spiritual LARPing. The idea of creating the containers in which people can lose that sense of self-conscious embarrassment, because there's a shared understanding that we're all doing this thing together in a kind of play space. But what that can do is set up a container in which then you can genuinely feel the reverential, worshipful attitude in a essentially non-ironic way within the context of a kind of ironic boundary marker. And I guess I was just going to throw that idea by you if you had any reflections on that as it relates either just to ritual or goodness, and the way that, what is the role of kind of irony in these things?
That really strikes me, because I just started doing the second Parallax course. And so the first episode of that involved a lot of collective invoking of embodied transcendental qualities, right? At one point I had everyone, maybe I'll even do this at the conference, where you start to have everybody invoke superlatives and then try to invoke superlatives all together. And the way into that for me with people is to say to them, yeah, this is going to be a little bit weird. It's going to be a little bit embarrassing. You're not used to doing this, and that's okay, right? I think part of the irony, the ironic lens has to be treated responsibly by whoever's directing the event, right? And that's mostly being more transparent and more relaxed about what's going on, right? So if I'm like leading a discussion or something, or if I'm like on a stage and people are listening, it's really important for me to say, like, look, there might be weird power dynamics here, right? It's like, just acknowledge that. And the same thing with invoking God or invoking goodness, right? There's lots of ways to intellectually question these things, and we should. But there's also ways to experientially play with them. And in order to feel liberated, I think, as contemporary beings to play in those spaces, it has to be a space where it says, I get it. This is going to be a bit weird. You're not going to be sure. We're not the masters of this skill. It's going to be strange. Maybe you're going to be embarrassed. It's going to be at least kind of silly, right? And that opening, because LARPing, or that kind of role play world, acknowledges up front that you're pretending, that it is silly, right? It's ridiculous to put on a costume and pretend to be someone. And that's okay. That's not a thing that says you're not authentic because you're playing. It's something that says, hey, we're authentic here together, and we're all going to play. We don't know how it's going to turn out exactly, but it's okay. And if you feel weird about it, that's fine. We all feel weird about it. We're just going to try this.
Yeah, I was intrigued by how far you could kind of take that, right? I mean, you mentioned all, invoking superlatives, but what if you invoke a sort of superlative image of yourself, right? There's sort of like I have an internal image of the sage that I could try to embody. And, what if you cosplay your internal sage? What if everyone shows up as their internal sage? I'm not saying we're going to do this for the retreat, but just this way of thinking about ritual and trying to live our goodest selves, in the sense of trying to overcome all the potential limitations and boundaries that keep us from that we get via a lot of our hyper-reflexive, cognitive, modern, rational mindset that we need to sort of not lose in order to do the good, in order to do the ritualistic activity, but somehow employ in the service of those things. And so that was one idea. Um, yeah, that's all.
There's a, for me, I might think in terms of something like a mode, right? Which is a bit like a role or play or a character, but a little bit more related to physiology and authenticity.
Mhm.
Right, so that we have something like, and this is one of the reasons I'm interested in the biochemistry, right, and the neuroelectrophysiology of the goodness mode, not just an academic discussion around who gets to say what is good, but how do we actually go into the state in which we feel good or can do good things, and how is that a little bit different than the other states that we go into, right? And I think there's been a lot of, maybe here's how goodness came up for me as a topic, because when I was a kid, it sounded like bullshit other people talked about, right? It sounded like a way to keep people in line. And people who did what they thought were good, they did not seem to be genuine, high integrity people to me. They seemed to be believer conformists when I was a kid. So I was very suspicious of this idea and very sensitive to what it was putting off the table that might actually be natural, rich, complex human experience. It wasn't until I was in my early teens, two things came up roughly the same summer for me. One was I was reading Chogyam Trungpa's Shambhala teachings, and which he has a really nice ability to bring out the clear, fresh, clean quality of the spiritualization in the natural world. And he told a story in one of his texts about two murderers who are on their way to kill a guy in the night. And one of them says, "Oh, full moon," and the other one looks, right? And for him, it meant something like the wish to respond to the goodness that's implicit in things of the world is built into our structure, such that even the worst person actually still has this impulse in their subconscious that can be activated. And at the same time, I was watching Twin Peaks, very young, and it was on the air. And this character that David Lynch and Mark Frost had created of Dale Cooper, of the clean, intuitive, rational, well-meaning, compassionate FBI agent who just loves this town of strangeness he's come into, loves the coffee and loves the trees and wants to help the people, right? And is not unaware of the darkness, is totally willing to go into the darkness, is curious about it, but is a very clean warrior of spiritual goodness. To me, it was that summer when I was reading Trungpa and watching Twin Peaks, I thought, oh, this is something I can actually get interested in. There is a future for goodness, because whatever the cleanness, whatever the power, whatever the intrinsic worthiness of this is, these people are not idiots, right? These are not dogmatic moralists. These are people who deeply understand the complexity of the world, and they're still saying, let's try to be good.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. That makes me think of this notion. I used to, even as a younger kid, I had this notion of I guess I thought of it in terms of telling a story, writing a short story or something. But it was the notion of imagine basically the smartest person in the world, or the smartest person that could possibly be, someone who contains, just maximal knowledge as humanly possible. Is that person in a state of despair, or is that person in a state of just blissful elation? What is the nature of being informed about the nature of reality, right? And it's, in some ways, it's just kind of a simple way of thinking about, is one an optimist or a pessimist? But it kind of got a particular flavor through Rick and Morty, which a lot of people kind of see as having various metamodern resonances to it. And I don't think it quite goes as where exactly I would go with it, but it does raise the question of like what the expansiveness of knowledge can do for your sense of the meaning of things and the goodness of things, right? Is someone who knows as much as humanly possible going to use that capacity to, take advantage of people and be self-destructive and hedonistic, or are they going to use that and, by recognizing the full diversity of the human and the natural possibilities, lean towards the good? And actually, this comes up too, I think, in the Everything Everywhere All at Once film, which is a similar kind of question about what you do with that. But I think that there's a tendency to assume that the more you know, the more the harder and the more painful and the sadder life gets. But I want to challenge that, and I think that there's a sense of goodness that shines through all of the deepening of awareness, which is what I hear you getting at, right? Because there's sort of a naive goodness that's sort of like, oh, you do the right thing and then you're a good boy and everyone likes you. But then there's this sort of like, no, you see through all that. You see the uses of morality, you see the vast spectrum of possibilities for experience. And rather than that leading you to become cynical and sort of destructive, it leads you to become that, Agent Cooper sort of figure of like willing the good and still choosing the good, even as you see the totality of things. And for me, what I'm getting at is I find that to be a very metamodern angle, is sort of like, after you know, how do you still approach all of what you know from the good? And of course, that what you know is always continuing to develop and grow, as we go forward and whatnot. So it's never a maximal knowledge in that sense, but just I don't know if any of that connects with your ways of thinking about these things. But
sure, I mean, in several different respects. One of the things about, say, Rick and Morty is it's an example of late postmodern entertainment, but like every late postmodern, there's a residue of something at the end. You're like, maybe these people are secretly caring. Right. I also relate it to something similar, which was the first season of True Detective, which was just a masterpiece of television. It seemed like very nihilistic, but actually it's trans nihilistic. If you follow it to the end, the main character dies and goes into nothingness, and then goes deeper into nothingness, into a kind of blended love that reinforces him, and comes out at the end and has this transfigured experience. And much like Everything Everywhere All at Once, where you're making that shift from, oh, nothing matters, to, oh, nothing matters. And the valence shift makes all the difference in terms of how we participate in the world. So when it comes to knowledge, I mean, there's always a question about knowledge, right? Is it how we experientially apprehend the world, or is it a set of data representing the world? Because if it's an intellectual left brain set of data relating to the world, there's a possibility that it's, no matter how much you get, you're always going to be disconnected. And in fact, maybe getting too much could be a problem. Mm-hmm. But then there's a sense of knowledge, which is closer to understanding, which is, right, what are the values? Do I know the values of things for myself and for those I care about? Do I know how to care, how to be embodied, how to locate the worth? Like, to know everything and not to know how to locate the worth of things, that's a terrible situation. And do we call that too much knowledge, or do we call that not enough knowledge? It's a semantic problem. But there's a way in which, if you were able to start to participatorily embody that knowledge, turn it into understanding, then I think it turns around and starts to migrate towards a performative telos of goodness very quickly. And we see that the placeholder for that is this residue of care that you find in the background or at the edges of late postmodern entertainment.
Yeah, and I tend to distinguish that move towards the performative orientation towards the teleological good through knowledge as what distinguishes just knowledge from wisdom. Like Rick might have a lot of knowledge, but is he wise? And it's like, how do you distinguish the two? Well, it comes down to that issue of how you employ, utilize, live through, and embody that knowledge. And then, of course, at that point, you're getting into bringing in, I think, other elements of the human being besides just your cognitive grasp on concepts and information. You're bringing in issues of will and affect, commitment, all sorts of other ways of being in the world that aren't just, knowledge based, but are of a deeper form of knowledge, which is embedded, embodied, participatory knowledge, which, yeah, for me is the hallmark between pure knowledge and the move to wisdom, which is essentially knowledge plus goodness, I guess you could say, in I don't know, in some ways, and certainly in the context of this conversation, I might throw that out there. Um, well, let's leave it there, I say, for now, because I feel like it's a deep well, and could keep going deeper. But I think this will kind of give people a taste for some of the issues and yeah, topics that will come up. So yeah, any final thoughts you want to throw in?
No, I could keep going down this path, but I guess that's for people who come to the event, who I'm looking forward to seeing again and getting to know, because I think these kind of events we're talking about are extremely important, both for ourselves and for building up a new kind of ethos on this planet. And I'm excited that something like goodness is going to be the theme, because it's so seldom the theme, even in advanced discussion and integration spaces. So I'm really looking forward to this.
Well, likewise, very excited. So yeah, it's actually not too far away at all. Yeah, I mean, we're down to counting it in days. So yeah, I definitely encourage. I'll post the link to register, and I'll just try to keep putting the word out. And we're looking forward to seeing people here and getting into all this and growing and experiencing learning together. So thanks, Layman. I appreciate it. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you in a few days.
Yeah, man. Looking forward to giving you a hug.
Likewise. All right. Adios. Until then.